Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Insight Live, the IT Experts Take. I'm Jason Rader, and I'll be your host today as we talk about the multi-cloud mindset. I hope you guys are ready for the multi-cloud mind meld with the folks that we've got on today. Love to welcome back Juan Orlandini, who is North America CTO at Insight. And we have a new, probably somebody who's going to be on here a lot, I can guess. At this point, we have Miles Ward, who is CTO of SADA, one of Insight's recent acquisitions, wholly owned subsidiary. We are so excited to have you, Miles. Welcome, sir.
Hey, thank you so much, Jason. I am excited too. This is exactly the conversation that we're having with customers every day. So I'm looking forward to getting into it.
Right on. So it's probably worth doing this. I mean, I know a lot of folks, I don't know. I guess it depends on where I'm at contextually as to whether I say the definition of multi-cloud means this or that. So let's say what we mean when we're talking about multi-cloud right now. Who wants to give a shot at that? And then I'll tell you why you're wrong.
I'll give it a shot because I'm usually wrong. And then we can go from there. So multi-cloud is at its core is really, hey, you're running workloads in multiple clouds, maybe at the same workload across multiple clouds, but typically not. And that's either the hyperscalers, the public clouds, or it could be a mixture of workloads that are running in the public cloud and a private infrastructure that is being run as a cloud.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree with that,
Miles.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything broken there. I think there are plenty of customers who would draw a straight line between private clouds and implementations that are cloud-like and pay-as-you-go, utility-delivered public cloud infrastructure. There are also a huge, long litany of services that would raise their hand and say, I promise, we're a public cloud. And I think maybe wouldn't fit that definition for us. But by and large, that's exactly right. It's trying to figure out how to take advantage of the resources and capabilities of more than one of the pay-as-you-go or utilization-based platforms. And you're exactly right that customers are struggling with this. Do I divide the same workload across more than one? Do I run separate things in separate places? How do I manage the division between these infrastructures?
Yeah, that's actually a topic that we've covered in the past, Miles, where you're federating across the clouds. And I don't know that most people are ready to federate across clouds because, oh my gosh, that is a next level of complexity and abstraction that is not something you buy off the shelf. It's something that you have to build yourself typically, and that is a big, big lift. So federation is probably not in the game for most of the audience, but the concept of putting the right workload in the right location definitely is.
Yeah, we've seen one of the categories of customers for which this is an existential need. If you're a software company, an ISV that's vending software to customers, especially B2B software, you're going to be largely and increasingly doing that through marketplaces, whether that's AWS's or Azure's or Oracle's or Google's or any of the rest of them. And those marketplaces have a requirement that the infrastructure being used to service customers on their platform is hosted on that platform. So if you know you're going to have to be in all the public clouds by default, that's just the only way to get that route to customers. You have to work out some architecture for being able to deploy your system in each of those clouds. And we've seen customers that run a split brain database across all three of the locations. It's one installation, multi-tenant across all. The complexity there is not one cloud plus one cloud plus one cloud equals three. It's one cloud and its connection to the other one. That's 1, 2, 3 things, and the next cloud and its connection. Okay, so it's 5 units of complexity for the result of 3 clouds. We also have customers that would think of one cloud as like the home cloud, where identity and access management, where access controls, where all the logging, where telemetry happens. And the other 2 clouds maybe are the deployment for end user services or containers that manage data ingest or export. So those kinds of patterns are ones we're working through all the time to make sure that you don't have this explosion of operational burden associated with multiple platforms.
Well, that was a lot.
You have us in the room. What do you expect?
Well, I think that in what I agree with all of you, and I was joking on the let me tell you why you're wrong, because just prepping for this conversation, I did the standard go to search engine and show me the stuff that in the last month that's going on with multi-cloud. And there's some people taking a really hard line between that hybrid and multi, and I don't necessarily care. Whatever somebody wants to call it, we got to get down to where it matters is what part is going to be you, what part is going to be them, and if it's them, how many thems is there going to be, and then what are we trying to do with all the thems that are involved? Is it from an availability perspective? Is it from a cost or those kinds of things? And I think so I'm not such a hard line on what it really has to be called, as much as we've just got to make sure we're making the right choices based on the right information. And when I say we, I mean us with our clients, or us as our own entity doing those things appropriately. Because, getting tied up around that nomenclature is kind of a waste of time at a certain point.
What we find all the time is the big reason for the distinction between multi-cloud and hybrid cloud is the enormous impedance mismatch especially on the financial side of physical infrastructure and pay-as-you-go infrastructure. This stuff you pay monthly. It's in the OpEx category. If you figure out how to save money, you keep that money. This side, you're planning 3 years in advance. Maybe you can get deep discounts. You're talking multi-year amortization of the costs. And so helping plan a business that is operating in hybrid must grapple with both financial models, where somebody that's purely multi-cloud, only in cloud, but uses more than one, everything is still utility pricing. You're just in kind of negotiating and managing on that side. So there's at least one layer of complexity that's removed. Another part that happens all the time in multi-cloud versus hybrid cloud debates is the software vendors are different. So, we're watching software consolidation, right? VMware and Broadcom just pushed out 56 products they're going to sunset. They're changing the part of the responsibility that they will take in the overall structure of your stack. And so you have a very different composition of solution on the hybrid side than you do from a multi-cloud side, where it's exclusively products vended by the hyperscalers and the ISVs that support them. So it's different boxes of Legos.
Well, and they're similarly colored Legos too on top of that, Miles, right?
That's right.
And that's part of the problem, because on the on-prem world, you do have an ecosystem of players that are trying to create a CapEx model and an OpEx model for consuming their stuff. And then the public clouds, you can buy reserved instances or reserve capacity, which is really more a CapEx than an OpEx model, right? Mm-hmm. And then, oh my gosh, I mean, think about the explosion of processing that the finance side of the house has. And that is it's actually one of the things that we counsel all the time is you better stand up a FinOps team that is just as capable as your DevOps teams or SRE teams or platform engineering teams or whatever other teams you have running the engineering of your organization, because that financial side of the house just as important, if not more so. Otherwise, you are going to get in trouble.
It's just as complex as the things we're talking about.
Yeah. I got a number for you that's gonna bake your noodle, right? So we're a reseller. We help customers consume Google Cloud. In so doing, we have to compute their bill, right? That's part of the most basic part of doing the work. For our bill, when we interact with Google, that's 1.2 trillion records a month, trillion with a T, that describe what the cost of cloud is to those customers. That's every IO to individually addressed IO devices, every kilobyte of network traffic that goes back and forth over the wire, every second of virtual machine time that's consumed. So the granularity of this stuff in comparison to you bought 4 machines and they cost $6,000 a piece, and here's your invoice for those is really substantial. And in that complexity is where all the opportunity for optimization lives. Either you dive into it and build systems that can manage it, or you just sort of take the bill as it comes and pay what shows up. The companies that sit in the former camp actually earns very real dividends.
Great. Yeah, and I'll tell you that part of it as well is at some point you have to decide whether or not your variability and all that is worth that complexity that you're talking about. Right?
Sure.
And that's actually part of that right workload for the right stuff. And if you know that some workloads are very static or at least bounded by some measure, whatever the measure is, you can make an informed decision. I should buy reserved instances, or I should buy an on-prem infrastructure or a hybrid model or one of those things. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. If you are an AI company, because every conversation now has to have AI, right? And you know that you're going to be doing GPU-based calculations continuously forever, you probably should be buying those GPUs rather than renting those GPUs and putting them in someplace maybe that's co-located to or at least close enough to a public cloud so you can interact and interface with them. If you're not doing that, if you're maybe just doing fine tuning on an occasional basis, or you're doing some RAG or one of those kinds of things, you're probably perfectly fine renting those GPUs, right? And those are the kinds of decision matrix things that we have to work through with our clients all the time.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right that all the different hardware categories, as they match up to the software opportunity that sits on the far side, present this optimization problem. That's a fascinating problem. It's the reason the whole FinOps discipline exists, because there are so many options, and most business buyers don't care about all that. They just want to hear what's the right answer, what's the cheapest way to do this stuff in the long term. And I think you're also correct that if we could all just tell the future, and I could know exactly how many customers I'm going to get and how many models I'm going to get asked to get trained and how much throughput that new update to the web page is going to demand, then yes, you could buy in advance and you'd get a great deal on it. The problem with reality is it has nothing to do with the plans that you set in place. And in reality, it's very nice to have something that's a little flexible. That's why almost every on-prem system I've ever seen has a little buffer, a little extra just in case, right? So I think there's a lot where we're spending cycles with customers thinking through each of those optimization decisions. How do you protect yourself against the success disaster? Everybody wants to use that new tool that you built. The failure disaster, the customers just don't show up the way that your sales folks said that they would. So you gotta be able to build in the right kind of flexibility and reject flexibility when you don't need it for workloads that are obviously totally stacked.
Well, and Miles, what struck me in what you were just saying is that in both of those scenarios, you're talking about new workloads that you're predicting into the future, right?
Sure.
And there's a huge swath of existing workloads that you actually have to consider in a different fashion, right? And some of those workloads might be the ones that got written back in the 90s or 80s, for all I know, right? And that are still running today. And those you probably need to consider way differently than the new iterations that you're talking about. And there's a whole set of math associated with that is much, much different as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that a lot of the brand new ISVs are starting to look at, right? You've got this chunk of legacy software that only a limited number of your people even understand how it behaves. They've kind of personally internalized its bugs as the reality of its function. They just sort of know how to hold their head this way when they click the button on the mouse, and then that's how you get the right answer out of the database. The AI tools that are being built now, especially for interpreting existing software, are an incredible opportunity, right? If you've got old crunchy stuff, rather than running an emulation layer and hosting it in a virtual machine and encapsulating it behind 1,000 firewalls, because Lord knows what it exposes as ports, and you probably can just stare at the screens and get an AI to squirt out a version of that running in JavaScript in a browser. And maybe, just maybe, you can dig yourself out of some of this legacy software doom.
Yeah, well, maybe.
Maybe. I know. We've done it like twice. We only got to do it like 50,000 more times, right?
Oh, we got a question on the from the audience.
Actually, it's more of a comment, but thanks, Perry, for the comment. Extremely well said, Miles. Infrastructure capacity forecasting can be as, sorry, messed my screen up, as forecasting be as trivial as predicting what will happen with the stock market.
Yeah, so, we can only tell the future, right?
Exactly right.
And I think that was, you made that comment a minute ago, and thanks, Perry. And I was thinking, you said predicting what's going to happen in the future, but sometimes that the expectation is that you're going to predict very quickly. And you made the reference to people wanting this giant knob they can turn to switch from one hyperscaler to the next based on negotiating cost or those kinds of things. And I literally think that the top execs in the organization think that would be a fantastic way to go.
Oh, yeah.
And you also mentioned that how much money am I willing to spend to not get nailed by this sales guy?
Right.
Every
Like,
time.
we could all be, students of Keynesian economics and believe that every one of the participants is intensely rational and they've got a fully fleshed out spreadsheet with all the positives and negatives associated with a given decision. We don't work that way. We're all humans. We're nuts. We have limited information. Most of it's misinformation from strange marketing and stuff. So we've got to be able to cut through and make choices. We're in the real world. I gotta serve web traffic today. So I'm not going to have a Pareto optimal plan. I'm going to have whatever plan I can figure out this afternoon. And so retaining a certain amount of flexibility has its own direct, measurable financial benefit. I've watched plenty of customers be dead certain they're going to go do this. And then all of a sudden the market says, nope, you're doing this, buddy. So we really have to spend the cycles to think through what flexibility we can get out of these architectures. For good reason, for just the world changes or plans changes. And then there's also exactly the reasons you were talking about, all of the bad behavior by providers, or you end up, getting a soured relationship. We had a whole bunch of healthcare companies call us up. They said, Amazon says they're going to get into pharmaceuticals now, so I can't use Amazon anymore. You just got to help me out, right? Like, I'm not going to pay one of my competitors. Retailers figured that out quite a bit ago, but as Amazon expands what they do, more and more categories want to move. Those kinds of, let's call them like non-tactical reasons, strategic reasons to make a difference in your infrastructure means that the investments we make in lowering the barrier of entry between the platforms pay dividends for everybody. If it was just easy, if you could just move a workload from here to there to here to there to there willy-nilly, that reduces the lock that the vendors have on us as consumers and sets all of us up to make more efficient choices at every step.
Well, and worth the squeeze, right?
Yeah.
It goes.
Yeah, I mean, the vendors themselves have a vested interest in locking you into their set of capabilities, right? And they're gonna, and I get it. I mean, and some of it is intentional, some of it is unintentional. Because the unintentional part comes from they're all innovating in slightly different directions. And one day AWS might have the coolest thing in one area, and then the next thing you know is Azure or GCP or whatever. And if you're trying to bring product to market as fast as possible, you're probably going to go with the highest innovation, highest differentiation that you can. And then next thing you know, you're locked into that very innovative thing. Moving VMs, very easy, right? That we can do all day long. Containers, we're still kind of figuring that one out, right? A little bit. Well, it's easier, but it's not. Functions, oh my gosh, good luck.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, each one of those platforms totally proprietary, totally different.
And I'm going to argue one. I agree with you personally. I think you're right. We would go for the highest innovation, but that's what we would go for. I think there are some bargain shoppers out there that want the cheapest stuff they can possibly get and still be in the cloud, right? And still take advantage of the OpEx versus CapEx model and the other things that they're getting. And that's another interesting decision. But then there's the complexity of then those folks say, hey, I want to operate multiple clouds because hey, we want an availability thing going on from that perspective. And then that introduces a lot of extra complexity and thus cost to pull those things off. It's just, I wish there was an easy answer, but there's not.
We had a spectacular customer, a great example of this on-prem versus cloud decision-making. They ran a very particular VDI product for government users. So high security, high regulatory compliance needs. And to efficiently do VDI, you need to be able to display video. The hardest thing for them to do was to go to youtube.com, right? Where you're just running a full streaming video feed that has to get transpiled into a VDI instance and then streamed back subsequently to the downstream user. And they'd worked out that this one particular Intel chipset had the teensiest, crappiest GPU on it, which was just perfect for accelerating VDI workloads. And to do that in cloud, they had to buy whole NVIDIA, Tesla, monster GPUs, of which they were only using this tiny slice. And none of the cloud providers would produce an instance that had this specific chipset because it's actually a desktop chipset. They had to run desktop licensing, desktop software. So it's all sideways and inside out. Those are the edge cases where I think there are absolutely optimizations that you can arrive on for specific use cases in specific environments. For the other 90% of us that are trying to serve, web pages with SaaS software on them, that which is the majority of the content in public cloud, that is just really the bread and butter. It turns out all the clouds can run that great. And you don't have to sort of work out something. You should let the product managers on their side do the innovation work of driving Intel and AMD and ARM and all the rest of the providers to grind the price point of that stuff down. So I think the more you can recognize and work with your solutions providers to identify what of what you're doing is boring and how do you make more of what you do as boring as possible so that you spend all that creativity and optimization on the actually unique parts of what you do, where probably the biggest dividends of that investment will be paid.
We got another comment from Perry. Thanks again. He'd love to hear kind of the take that we've got on the best open source or hyperscaler offerings to manage a multi-cloud environment. And I think this is a great question to kind of ponder, because we've talked about before that, the additional complexity based on the tool sets that you have to use to manage multi-cloud might outweigh the benefits of actually doing it.
Sure. We've have a lot of customers that that would define this problem a couple of different ways, right? Like manage it.
Sure.
So like I remember, ancient
operate,
days, when in order to be able to make sense of the AWS system, which had no user interface or console at the time, you used RightScale as a way to boss around AWS so that you could make sense of what was going on. And then eventually AWS made a console and everything got a lot easier to operate. So running across more than one cloud, there are a couple of different products that would try to be your layer for interfacing to the cloud, where you never interact with the cloud console and you just interact with I'll call that a platform as a service approach, Render or Vercel or Netlify. There are a bunch of web-oriented tools that sit up there. If you're in infrastructure land, VMware has tooling for that stuff. Certainly lots of building blocks that sit at that layer. There are an emerging cluster of customers that would describe, like Juan was talking about, that containers is where they will manage as a unit across cloud providers, whether you're using, Docker's now almost sunsetted out tools for this stuff, Kubernetes as kind of the default for that. You're still stuck on Mesos because you started this stuff earlier than everybody else. There's a whole set of layers there. What is still missing, in my view, in the market is a reliable way other than the SaaS offerings from the different database providers to manage open source databases across hyperscale providers in a way that is replicated and consistent and reliable and relatively low cost. Getting all four of those is a relatively difficult thing. And the same with storage. So you can get NetApp as incredible stuff, and you can have NetApp on-prem and NetApp in the cloud, and they can all replicate and all the rest. It'll cost you. So you've got to make that trade-off between how much work and how much hands-on engineering are you willing to do with open source tools to manufacture your platform versus how much cost are you ready to bear associated with getting somebody else to do it for you.
Yeah, before we get to Boyd's question here, just I'll add another thing that slightly different direction from that the way you answered it. Is that there's an operational model to this in the traditional DevOpsy world, which is largely what we're talking about when we're talking about cloud. You gave each one of the DevOps teams a wide latitude into selecting tools and platforms to consume and all that other stuff. And there's a growing movement towards actually putting little arms around that. And for that, there's a very strong indication that there is one open source tool out there called Backstage that might become the place for you to start being able to do some of this coordination and discovery and controls, so that you can have a platform team that's dedicated to selecting the right places to do the things that you do, and expose that in a way that is friendly to the DevOps teams, accelerates their time to features or time to product, and also gives you some control. So a slightly different thing. It's not a management tool, but it's a control tool, for lack of better terms.
Yeah,
right?
there's manage the tech, or there's manage the people.
Yeah,
and developer experience is just as important as DevOps or the actual infrastructure work. So we're huge fans of Backstage too. Great product for helping companies build their developer experience. For managing we think of, all of the different classes of risks as things that have to be managed. Complexity is a risk, got to manage that. Security is a risk, got to manage that. For Boyd's question around orchestration, we see the majority of our customers are some combination of Terraform, Ansible, and containerization as the core way to be able to have a system that reliably works across multiple clouds and sets them up to be able to automate the majority of what they do. For FinOps, there's a new system that's a part of the FinOps Foundation. I sat together with J.R. Stormont to help get that stood up. It's called Focus, which is FinOps cost and utilization specification. It's a way to ensure that you can transform the outputs from the programmatic bills from AWS, Azure, GCP, and others into a standardized format in your data warehouse of choice, so you can make sense of these crazy bills and compare them apples to apples. So super useful to use the Focus spec for that.
Thanks, Boyd. We appreciate the question. So, okay, well, let's settle this right now. Which hyperscaler is the best?
Who's been in all three of the data centers? You've been in an Azure and an AWS and a GCP data center?
No.
So I've been in all three. So
you're a nerd.
I'm a nerd. I have worked at a terrible startup that sold social media software to Microsoft. So they needed to install a copy locally. They let me into Global Foundations. Nice. So I walked in and slid a machine into the rack which is, for those of you in the security profession, this should be giving you a certain amount of terror. I am not the guy who should be passing security qualifications. This is just,
we don't even let you in headquarters at this point.
No, they're like, the furry one, kick the furry one out. So have stepped foot in Global Foundations. I think before really it was hosting Azure at the time, and then did data center and point of presence, which the data centers are cool. They're humongous, but the points of presence are really like where the plugs get plugged into the other plugs. You poke this little chunk of fiber and slow down the communications between the United States and Japan by 20 gigabits a second, right? Like really incredible physical spaces. And I will say, while all of those data centers are better than the crappy one I built for my startup, and I mean crappy, Google's isn't shaped like everybody else's. It smells different. It's got different screws. Cables are all different. It hasn't been a TCP IP packet in 15 years. It's weird in there. Kind of feels Star Trek-y. So I have my preference.
So having been in a lot of data centers, not particularly those, they were actually changing the nature of what they are. That's a whole nother conversation, right? And I was just talking to a colo provider talking about hybrid environments where they're planning for 500 kilowatt racks. Right.
Right. Yeah, you're talking like heatsink blocks and active cooling, and
And, it used to be a 10 kilowatt hour rack was like kind of sort of on the high end. That's becoming nothing. That's like a few U worth of power. And so, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes into this, by the way, that we haven't even touched on.
Well, don't get me started about AI and the amount of power it's going to take for us. I mean, we could just go on super nirvana.
The AWS Glacier racks were designed specifically to be cold spots in the rack clusters. They were deployed to keep the hot racks away from each other. Right? They're just literally productive heat sinks.
Yeah.
Well, the catalyst for that question, I didn't think I was going to get such thoughtful answers to, was, do we feel like there are any hyperscalers that are out there that are kind of friendlier to the multi-cloud approach, if you will? I can't name anything off the top of my head that makes me believe that. I mean, I know Microsoft is reaching out from an open source perspective and some of those things, but I don't know. You got any comments about that, guys?
Everybody's fighting for the control plane. I think everybody has come to the realization it's not going to be a single colored world into the future, including the private data centers. So the real conversation is really around who's going to manage the workloads and who's going to control the flow of the workloads from one location to another. And you can control a lot of the innovation if you control the backplane. That is much to be fought over and very much unsettled conversation at this point.
I mean, I would say Google being in third place is definitely incentivized to
try hardest
to enable the other two, right? They're the ones who have to play the compatibility game. And as the ones who invented and open sourced Kubernetes, and as the kind of core guts that everybody is now using to do this kind of interoperability work, seems like they're certainly pushing that ball pretty far. I wrote a paper in 2016 called "What If You Could Run the Same Everywhere," that talked through kind of the mechanicals for that. I think certainly there is, you could be unlocked at the hyperscaler bill level of the problem and totally locked in to the Kubernetes API, right? You can imagine it doesn't matter where you sort of shift that abstraction layer, somebody's going to have lock and key someplace. The real challenge for our customers is often figuring out how many of their innovation points or creativity points, or however you want to think about the way that they spend attention, do they want to spend on moving up this layer of abstraction, and what benefits do those abstractions pay? I have, same as you're talking about, Juan, where customers find something that's static and figure, hey, this sort of makes more sense in a data center. We have plenty of customers that do all of this instrumented, convoluted orchestration to lay something out in a serverless pattern, and then look at the request rates and the actual utilization and go, I just rent a virtual machine and stick it on there and it costs me a tenth. Like, maybe I should do that.
That debate is not settled, right? Monolithic versus whatever other thing. So yeah,
like so many of these technologies, a bunch of them are built to solve human problems. Like microservices there, so that team number one and team number two don't have to high five each other to be able to ship independently. Not really so that it's a cleaner architecture. It's a vastly more complicated architecture. You just actually can get stuff done because you don't have to have global consensus to ship in the monolith. That's the kind of thing where I think you've got a whole bunch of these tools being decided for psychological reasons before they're being decided for technical reasons.
I've noticed that a lot through my entire career. This is not a new thing. I've literally in dialog boxes where you pick this if you didn't want to talk to a person, basically just overrides the settings somebody else had. And I think we mentioned it before, some decisions are made and not a necessarily rational or technical aspect. And we've got to be able to shift with those things too. So as much as cool nerds can come up with great solutions, it's also got to fit with the business. It's also got to fit with the people that are using it or adopting it or operating it. And that's an interesting thing that we can't work out from a equation perspective. It's going to have to be.
It depends region to region. Level of growth, like some companies that are growing slowly, some of this stuff doesn't make any kind of sense. Other companies that have totally breakneck growth, you got to be way ahead of the curve to be able to not get caught flat-footed, right? So that's why the kind of consulting that we do is as useful as it is. It's very hard as an individual customer and a company to look around and find identical peers to you doing exactly the same kind of stuff that just maybe 6 months ahead, so you can learn the lessons from them. My company, our company together, we got tens of thousands of customers that we're working with. And we're aggregating all this information. So I can tell you, I have 3 customers that are kind of really like you, and this is what worked for them. Let me break down the kind of pattern of behaviors. That kind of compression of expertise is just a huge value add in thinking through these kind of complicated problems.
Well, I think we're probably at a wrapping point. This is going to have to be continued for sure, because I think we could talk and break a record here. But I do think, we like to kind of finish off with kind of recommendations. And maybe there's 2 sides to a recommendation, because it sounds like there's the folks that Juan talked about that have been in this for a while and are trying to figure some stuff, or have been in business for a while. Our company has been in business for 30 years. Our stuff was not designed for the cloud that we've been operating on. And then there's the folks that are trying to get the most leverage, to your last point, Miles, of the latest and greatest that's going to keep them on the front end of this. Would there be different guidance we would give to one versus the other, or is it kind of the same?
You're making that as an or statement, Jason? Yeah. And I don't know that it's an or statement, because it's an and statement, because any organization that's relatively long-lived, and again, we're in IT, so long-lived.
5 years.
Yeah. 5 years, right? They're going to have some of the old crusty that they're going to have to maintain. And there's a whole topic of conversation on technical debt and all that other stuff, right? And then there's the new innovations that they're trying to do in order to bring new products and goods and services, either internally or externally. And then for those, you do have to manage both, right? Now, what Miles might have been talking about a little bit more is about, hey, it's a new scrappy startup that's trying to capture the market in a new creative way. Yeah, there's no legacy. Go figure out the right way to do this and all that. But at some point down the road, by the way, that's going to become.
Yeah, you could start off great and end up wrong, you know?
Right.
We try to call technology that's been doing the right thing for a business for 20 years legendary, as opposed to legacy tech. Legendary. And there's plenty of legendary apps out there. And I think by and large, if they've been running successfully for that period of time, you're going to want to tread lightly when you describe that you're going to make some radical improvement in the price performance of that system. But things which do not change are dead. That's just literally like, that's the definition thereof, right? So you've got to be thoughtful about making even the most ancient, most legendary of your applications be alive by re-ratifying that they pass the security requirements that you've got, understanding what the requirements would be if you had to migrate it to a different physical infrastructure, thinking through the risks that you bear associated with loss of institutional knowledge or familiarity with the operational context of those applications. So we try to help companies at every one of these stages, from totally harebrained startup to fast. What we find all the time is the big enterprises want to go fast like the startups, and the big startups want to be huge like the enterprises. And so we have a lot to learn from each other in terms of how to approach this stuff. I've seen plenty of enterprises buy a small startup to say, "Oh, we're gonna be fast like them because we got their sort of systems involved and in place." That you've got to work the change management to be able to actually bring that innovation into the business and apply it to all the broad problems that companies continue to have. So I think it's never been easier. Like, we have an incredible new tool set associated with faster IDEs and clearer development environments, better operational guidance, more red books than there have ever been about how to make this stuff easy. But we have an even harder environment to spur change, to sponsor change than there's ever been. It's a complicated macroeconomic scenario. We got a lot of people trying to be risk averse. So we've made it easier than ever, and it's harder than ever. We got to find the middle line to helping businesses move forward.
Well, and the pace of innovation is not changing, right, Miles? And so that it's not only easier, but there's more easy things to learn. So at some point, the number of easy things you got to learn also becomes a problem of its own. So you asked for some advice, Jason, whether hybrid or multi-cloud, and the answer is yes, more than likely. All right. And it's just all about making sure that you understand what that yes means for the workload, not for the organization. Well, and the organization. So
that was going to be my kind of addition to what you guys said, because when you were talking, Miles, I was thinking, well, you made some big changes, but there's also, you talked about the organizational change management that would need about. There's a culture change that has to change. That again, that cultural fit. You buy a startup, like, you're not a startup, but the reason that I think our organizations work well together is the culture, I think, is there. Yeah. And that is hugely important. And if the culture isn't ready to adopt, the tech is almost meaningless.
Right. It's just you can chuck whatever proposal you want at the wall. If there's nobody there to catch it, it's not going anyplace. And I think there's a lot where the cloud providers and the technology ecosystem in large is doing everything it can to help companies modernize, help them mature, help them take the next step forward in efficiency and automatability, in systematic behaviors for their systems. So I think there's a lot where you've got a whole multi-trillion-dollar industry trying to help, right? We're all doing our very best to push companies forward, help them be more efficient, more productive. So reach out to your technicians, your vendors, your suppliers, all those folks. They're all eager to help you take the next step forward.
Love it. I'm doing my part.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you guys so much. Thank you out there. We appreciate the interaction with the folks out there that are commenting. Thank you guys so much. If you want to know more about what we do, please come visit us at insight.com and join us next time on Insight Live. Thanks all.